Concealer hides the bruises, but the Mafia sees everything. Lena Torres had two choices: stay and die slowly, or run and risk dying fast. But when a stranger in a bespoke suit looked past her fake smile and saw the bloody truth she'd hidden for 2 years, the game changed. He didn't ask permission. He just deployed his criminal empire to hunt down her abusive husband. Because when an underworld boss claims you, your enemies become his prey.
Let us open this file by examining the subject, Lena. She is pressed against freezing bathroom tiles, tasting the metallic copper of her own blood. She is locked in the classic paralysis of trauma, caught between the agonizing darkness of captivity and the void of a world with no safety net. You and I have likely studied these responses, but this is a clinical demonstration of pure survival. The pathology twists when an anomaly enters her orbit. He offers no therapeutic comfort, only a chilling promise of retribution. The ultimate irony is that her savior is a predatory criminal architect. It serves as a dark psychological truth. Sometimes, the only hands capable of pulling a victim from the abyss are the very ones that engineered the darkness. We must note the profound absence of tears. The weeping ceased months ago, replaced by the grim neurological realization that sorrow provides no physical shield against a clenched fist. Instead, Lena performs a detached assessment of her own wreckage. The facial hematomas can be concealed. Her ribs radiate intense pain but remain structurally intact. Outside the door, her abuser, Eric, paces the hallway. His toxic aggression simmers into a cowardly silence, masked by the canned laughter of a television. She forces her trembling frame upright to face the mirror. At 26, her gaze displays the exhausted vacancy of a psyche depleted by chronic abuse. It clinically proves a devastating reality. The most catastrophic traumatic scars are never the ones visible on the epidermis. In exactly 6 hours, she must report to a local diner, trading private terror for public servitude. Her motor skills betray a violent flood of adrenaline, hands trembling as she watches pink water spiral down the basin. She methodically rehearses the fabricated narrative of a clumsy fall, aware her colleague Maria will offer only a non-confrontational glance. Lena reaches for her cosmetics, transforming a grooming ritual into a desperate psychological defense mechanism. She applies the foundation with surgical precision, burying the forensic evidence of his violence beneath a synthetic mask. It highlights a tragic societal pathology we see entirely too often. The general public typically prefers a comfortable deception over the ugly, disruptive reality of active human abuse. We observe the subcutaneous hemorrhaging spreading like a biological ink stain. It is a creeping rot she represses until a fragile baseline of normalcy is established. Stepping into the bedroom, she finds Eric sedated by heavy sleep. We are documenting the textbook, suffocating cycle of abuse. By morning, he will perform the role of the remorseful partner, pouring coffee and manufacturing a hollow apology. Lena will accept it, paralyzed by the anticipatory dread of what occurs if he stops simulating empathy. Listen closely, because this brings us to a critical clinical observation. Accepting a counterfeit apology never actually generates physical safety. She retreats to the sofa, her heart rate accelerating into severe tachycardia at every subtle creak of the floorboards. Dawn arrives and Lena evacuates the apartment. The diner functions as an essential psychiatric sanctuary. Subjected to terrifying domestic volatility, she clinically regulates her nervous system through the restaurant's rigid protocols. The patrons construct a controlled behavioral vacuum where variables are predictably quantified. The repetitive labor provides a dissociative comfort, allowing her consciousness to temporarily detach. Entering the kitchen, Maria instantly registers the heavy cosmetics. There is no verbal interrogation, merely the silent acknowledgement of trauma. Sometimes, the most profound therapeutic empathy does not require a verbal confession. It is simply providing the order pad so the autonomic rhythm of survival can safely resume. She navigates the shift in a fugue state, projecting an artificial smile driven entirely by motor memory. She observes a young couple engaged in physical affection. Lena processes this data, but her traumatized cortex cannot contextualize it. The concept of touch and acting as comfort rather than a precursor to violence has become entirely incomprehensible. Then, the lunch rush hits. The sensory overload functions as a potent neurological analgesic, suppressing the pain radiating from her ribs. Distributing the plates, she successfully mimics a functional human rather than a victim anticipating her next assault. True cognitive survival often dictates finding an anchor in the chaos. She maintains this operational baseline flawlessly right up until Maria aggressively seizes her arm. Maria exhibits acute anxiety, warning Lena of the new arrivals. The proprietor has comped their beverages, displaying a highly submissive behavioral pattern. We focus our clinical lens on the subjects. Two men present the impulsive aggression typical of syndicate muscle. But the primary subject, Adrian, presents a severe pathological deviation. He maintains a terrifying biometric stillness, projecting the calculated dominance of a megalomaniac narcissist. "I will handle it," Lena verbalizes, stepping toward the high-risk stimuli. She relies on her conditioned trauma responses to pacify volatile men, modulate the vocal tone, provide the service, and endure. She activates her psychological shielding, burying the panic. "Good afternoon, gentlemen. I am Lena." The protocol aborts when the subject establishes eye contact. Adrian initiates a forensic psychological evaluation of her microexpressions. "Water," he dictates, vibrating with unquestionable authority. Lena complies through automatic trauma mechanisms, dragging ink across her notepad. The subordinate males generate noise, but her auditory processing filters it out. She senses his analytical gaze, dismantling her cognitive barriers. Checking a reflective surface, she verifies her cosmetic mask remains intact. Why does her nervous system register total exposure? You and I must analyze this dynamic. Men like Adrian do not merely observe their environment, they clinically dissect it. To a criminal architect operating in the darkest extremes, concealed trauma emits the absolute loudest frequencies in the room. Adrian Castellano weaponizes fear as his primary currency. The moment he processed Lena, he detected the acute cortisol spike of terror radiating from her. "She is pretty," Marco vocalizes. The subordinate represents the blunt force instrument of the syndicate, devoid of psychological perception. "Focus on your food," Adrian commands, his icy tone instantly regulating the group's behavior. His hyperfocus remains tethered to the waitress. He tracks her conditioned motor responses, isolating the severe guarding rigidity in her shoulders. It is the undeniable biometric posture of an organism aggressively protecting freshly damaged tissue. This clinical assessment proves a grim reality. We are perpetually blind to the brutal psychological warfare occurring within the private lives of those right in front of us. We have all documented this defense mechanism, the heavy cosmetics executed with the desperate precision of an organism attempting to survive. Adrian catalogues it immediately. Within his violent empire, physical brutality is the baseline vernacular. He has processed this manifestation of trauma endlessly. Yet, observing it on this civilian triggers an uncharacteristic cognitive dissonance. in his hardened pathways. No, nothing interesting. He deceives his lieutenant. His focal point is anchored to Lena across the diner. She actively attempts to minimize her spatial footprint, but his analytical brain absorbs every variable. He documents the fine tremors in her extremities, the calculated gait, and the respiratory caution of a subject utterly terrified to expand a fractured rib. Adrian isolates the precise microsecond she detects his observation. Panic shatters her artificial presentation before she violently reinstates the synthetic smile. "Is everything okay?" she inquires, her tone stripped of resonance. "Fine," Adrian responds. "The check, please." She initiates an immediate tactical retreat as Marco generates meaningless data. Adrian's processing remains locked onto the raw terror in her eyes. He commands his cortex to disengage, acknowledging that a kingpin does not inherit a civilian's domestic tragedy. It is a cynical but effective life lesson. Absolute emotional detachment is the ultimate survival tactic. He deposits a dense stack of currency and exits the diner, but halfway to the street, his forward momentum abruptly terminates. From the threshold, Adrian subjects her to further clinical observation. Her eyes track the exits with the hypervigilance of a captive animal. Acquire her dossier, Adrian instructs his enforcer. Names, residential coordinates, everything. Dante nods silently. Adrian steps into the cold without a strategy. His pathology dictates that abandoning this subject is no longer an acceptable variable. Inside, Lena's shift degrades into a dissociative blur. Clearing his table, she locates $200 over a $70 invoice. She interprets this as a standard narcissistic display of financial dominance. Stick with me, because we must analyze this pivot. True psychological intervention is rarely gentle. That currency is not a gratuity. It is the binding contractual signature of a violent vendetta. Let us open this clinical file and examine the subject together, shall we? The diner is a chaotic sensory overload, yet the silent male in the corner shifts the room's psychological gravity. Lena suppresses her anxiety, burying currency into her apron while maintaining strict downward ocular fixation. His intense observation threatens to excavate the domestic violence she diligently conceals. By midnight, the somatic reality of her trauma flares. Untreated bone fractures along her ribs radiate acute agony. Bereft of painkillers, she actively avoids her reflection in the lavatory mirror, a textbook dissociation technique. The behavioral lesson here is bleak but vital. When an individual's neurological baseline is locked in pure survival mode, formulating any aspiration for a peaceful life becomes an absolute cognitive impossibility. Lena monitors the neon transit lights, exhibiting a profound craving for normative distress. To her conditioned mind, a hostile employer is preferable to mapping evasion routes within her own domicile. Her decaying apartment functions as a severe environmental trigger. Ascending the stairwell induces acute stress, exacerbating her skeletal injuries. When her key engages the deadbolt, her vascular system experiences sudden vasoconstriction. The primary stressor, Eric, is present. His dormant hostility physically permeates the threshold. Understand this fundamental truth of systemic pathology. True psychological terror rarely announces itself with a vocal outburst. Most often, it simply sits motionless in the dark, patiently waiting for the victim to arrive. You are late. The auditory stimulus drifts from the unlit room with unnerving detachment. Eric is calibrating the baseline for his psychological subjugation. Lena issues a fragmented rationalization, depositing her belongings with extreme hypervigilance. His grunt triggers an excess elation from her, in the pathology of trauma bonding. A neutral response is processed as profound mercy. She retreats to initiate domestic routines, suppressing the sharp pain in her torso. It is a terrifying flaw how rapidly the human brain normalizes suffering. As he encroaches, his palm clamps heavily over her shoulder. The clinical lesson is clear. Absolute interpersonal control never originates with a volatile explosion. It always begins as a silent, suffocating physical grip. Eric's grip stops short of bone fracture, yet the promise of harm vibrates beneath his skin. "You are highly proficient at this," he whispers. Lena maintains strict visual fixation on the stove, vocalizing hollow gratitude. Then we observe the classic narcissistic pivot. He issues an apology, weaponizing manufactured tenderness to secure a psychological pardon. He insists the violence was accidental. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. Propelling a human into a ceramic fixture is never an accident. Yet, survival requires total submission to the abuser's fabricated reality. She nods in forced compliance. The clinical reality is this: asserting personal dignity in the presence of a malignant narcissist is a dangerous vulnerability that guarantees further destruction. Eric increases physical compression to transmit a calculated threat. "I love you, you know that?" he murmurs with synthetic affection. Lena engages her trauma-induced compliance, agreeing seamlessly to secure a temporary cessation of hostilities. She monitors his retreat to the sofa, soon masked by the television. Paralyzed at the stove, she executes her tasks with robotic dissociation. The pathology of chronic abuse is not the acute panic. It is the learned helplessness that eradicates the will to resist. Yet, the variables are shifting. Elevated above her decaying architecture, an apex predator observes. Adrian Castellano, operating with the cold grandiosity of a megalomaniac, narcissist, stands detached at his penthouse glass, monitoring the bleeding city below. At 2000 hours, Dante deposits an intelligence dossier onto the desk. Her designation is Lena Torres, he reports. Age 26, expends her physical resources at a diner, struggling with basic sustenance. Adrian opens the file. A photograph confronts him, depicting a subject whose optical micro-expressions betray a stubborn survival drive. "Married?" Adrian inquires, his tone devoid of empathy. Dante confirms the diagnostic. She endures a severe trauma bond with a parasite named Eric Hale. He presents a documented history of aggression, without penal consequence, despite law enforcement knowing their coordinates. The psychological lesson is stark. The legal system is merely a paper shield, entirely useless against a malignant sociopath embedded inside your own domestic environment. 5 distress calls recorded, 0 punitive outcomes. Adrian clinically processes this institutional failure. It is a grim reality, the mathematics of trauma rigged against the victim. Medical files reveal fractured ribs, the somatic signature of blunt force trauma. Dante questions the logical utility of a syndicate leader fixating on a service worker. Adrian closes the folder, mandating continuous surveillance on her coordinates. Dante issues a warning regarding the risks of this deviation. Adrian is cognizant of his own moral decay. His pathology is saturated with lethal transgressions, yet the psychological lesson is absolute. Once an individual perceives the disintegration of a broken spirit, choosing willful blindness becomes the ultimate manifestation of cowardice. "Initiate surveillance," Adrian commands. "I require data on that parasite's movements." Dante shifts. "And the spouse?" he probes. Adrian maintains a psychopathic stare. Her specifically. Dante executes a slow nod, non-verbally questioning if the megalomaniac is making a catastrophic error. Statistically probable. Definitively certain, Adrian confesses. As the door seals, Adrian resumes his observation. Watch closely now, because this is where the behavioral matrix shifts. Millions of urban cells conceal identical domestic battlegrounds. The protocol of his criminal enterprise strictly forbids altruistic intervention. The harshest clinical truth is undeniable. Executing an extraction from a severe trauma bond universally guarantees the moral damnation of the intervening agent. Adrian rationalizes this behavioral deviation. He ingests ethanol to stabilize his cognitive processing. He cannot delete the visual data of contusions mapping a stranger's bones. He engineered his syndicate through absolute emotional detachment. Empathy correlates with rapid mortality. Yet, here is the psychological reality we must dissect. A subject's defining pathological choices are rarely calculated by logic. They materialize in the subconscious, propelled by an internal schema demanding intervention. 72 hours later, Lena moves through work when a phantom trigger strikes her nervous system. Her skin elevates in a classic threat reflex. She executes a defensive pivot, anticipating trauma, only to observe oblivious civilians. The megalomaniac's unseen surveillance had re-engaged. Lena attempts to overwrite her paranoia, yet hypervigilance adheres to her neural pathways. She perceives an invisible tracking mechanism, misattributing this to her degraded nervous system. Cohabitating with a volatile threat and maintaining a flight-ready state frequently induces hallucinations. Yet, a fragmented sector of her psyche hypothesizes a protective intervention. It is devastating metrics of psychological degradation when the presence of a stalker is processed as a rescue operation rather than a threat. By dawn, photographic intelligence materializes on the narcissist's desk. The data confirms a cyclical pathology of decay. Initial frames document Eric's exit. Within a 2-hour window, the parasitic subject is recorded heavily intoxicated in a deteriorating establishment. The surveillance captures Eric integrating with identical parasitic organisms. By afternoon, he returns to the containment unit, primed for violence. The nocturnal data induces muscular rigidity in Adrian's jaw, a micro-expression of homicidal ideation. He observes Lena, her cosmetics failing to mask the hemorrhaging. He tracks her midnight return, her posture indicating catastrophic fatigue. Her window illuminates, extinguishing 20 minutes later. The camera cannot pierce that darkness, but Adrian reconstructs the inevitable physical assault. Dante inquires how an unemployed dependent procures his toxins. Her service gratuities, Adrian replies, his tone dropping to absolute zero. The perverse irony of financial abuse is undeniable. The traumatized subject is coerced into funding the instruments used to fracture their own mind. He depletes her resources. Adrian vocalizes, "You and I will analyze this psychological descent together." We observe her calculating base currency for sustenance, exhibiting distress at a transit hub. In every frame, her hollow eyes scan backward, anticipating the primary stressor in her blind spot. Dante proposes executing a diplomatic intervention with the husband. We recognize this underworld terminology. It guarantees extensive physical trauma. Negative, not currently, Adrian dictates. When pressed, the megalomaniac maintains strategic silence, processing intense disgust toward the machinery of domestic terrorism. "I am formulating the protocol," he murmurs. The clinical truth of authoritarian power is severe. The microsecond of violent resolution crystallizes in a sociopath's mind. The ballistic sequence is irreversible. Let us open the file on Adrian Castellano and dissect his pathology together. He built his syndicate by identifying human vulnerabilities and surgically exploiting them. He intends to extract this traumatized woman without triggering her fear response. A megalomaniac narcissist like Adrian desires a dependent subject, simply swapping her domestic cage for his own. He clinically instructs his enforcer Dante to surveil the husband's associates. When Dante asks if the subject knows she is being watched, Adrian exhibits a chilling, calculated calm. He understands the manipulation required. The clinical lesson here is profound. The most dangerous changes in our lives rarely approach from the front. They manipulate our blind spots, while we are completely distracted by familiar pain. From his high-rise, Adrian fixates entirely on Lena. He recognizes her trauma bonding. She is trapped in a toxic loop, applying makeup over contusions and rehearsing excuses to shield her abuser. For a syndicate leader, the variable is never capability. It is the subject's psychological readiness to accept a new reality. The following morning, Lena performs repetitive tasks at the diner. Her co-worker, Maria, confronts her, asking when the charade will end. Lena offers a defensive deflection, whispering that everything is fine. Maria refuses to validate the heavy cosmetics and hyper-vigilant flinching. Lena dissociates, staring at the table as her nervous system misfires. The psychological truth remains. Denial acts as a temporary anesthetic for a fragile ego, but it absolutely refuses to suture the underlying trauma. Avoiding eye contact allows Lena to maintain her cognitive dissonance. Authentic empathy triggers a severe anxiety response she cannot process. She offers a vague rationalization, but Maria dismantles the defense mechanism, stating that a support system does not passively witness destruction. The clinical paralysis is clear. Lena views separation as a fatal event. Past behavioral data confirms this. Her previous escape attempt resulted in the abuser enduring a week-long period of physical captivity. The conditioning was successful. She learned that fleeing only escalates the punishment. Consequently, Lena fabricates a delusion of control. Maria simply grips her trembling hand. It presents a vital lesson. In cases of severe isolation, a singular point of physical validation can temporarily stabilize a psyche rapidly descending into fragmentation. You and I have likely observed this mechanism, a subject projecting stability while enduring extreme distress. Maria leans in and introduces a destabilizing variable. She reveals she used to have a sister, employing the past tense with deliberate gravity. She details how her sister harbored the identical delusion of control, an illusion shattered when authorities recovered her remains. This outcome causes an immediate fracture in Lena's psychological armor. Maria outlines the clinical reality that aggressors do not spontaneously rehabilitate. Their pathology merely escalates. Lena confesses total helplessness. This admission marks a critical therapeutic threshold. Acknowledging the imminent threat of mortality is terrifying, yet dismantling that denial is the mandatory first stage in the mechanics of human survival. Maria explicitly advises a total extraction protocol. Faced with this actionable step, Lena's defensive posture collapses into raw panic. She anticipates her abuser will initiate a lethal pursuit. Maria proposes institutional safe houses engineered for this demographic. Yet, Lena physically withdraws, retreating to the repetitive task of filling salt shakers. This is a textbook grounding technique. When the external environment becomes chaotic, the traumatized brain seeks equilibrium through microscopic elements of control. She issues a verbal delay, requesting time to process. As the diner's rush hour escalates, the sensory overload provides a convenient distraction. despite the physical pain radiating from her ribs. Hyperproductivity is a documented trauma response. Immersing oneself in mundane labor is often a subconscious strategy to delay confronting an inescapable timeline. The shift occurs during routine sanitation of a booth. Lena experiences the physiological phenomenon of gaze detection. She establishes visual contact with a male subject at table 14. His posture is rigidly controlled, displaying the focused fixation of a predator tracking prey. He executes a calculated nod, establishing an unsolicited psychological intimacy. Lena's autonomic nervous system floods with adrenaline. Her fine motor skills degrade rapidly as she attempts to process tableware. By the end of her shift, she identifies a coordinated surveillance pattern involving 3 distinct operatives. Her cognitive load is maximized. She bypasses visual self-inspection and evacuates through the service exit. The clinical takeaway is fundamental biology. When the primitive brain registers predatory focus in the environment, the only rational response is immediate evasion. Auditory input confirms pursuit, footsteps synchronizing with her erratic cadence. A backward glance verifies the threat. One of the operatives from the diner. Lena's fight or flight response fully activates. She initiates a sprint, but chest trauma severely limits her oxygen intake. The physical asymmetry is absolute. A measured application of force to her wrist abruptly arrests her momentum. Her defense is neutralized by the operative's controlled restraint. He attempts to de-escalate, identifying himself as Dante and stating that Adrian Castellano requires an audience. Lena is paralyzed by cortisol. We must note the cognitive dissonance of this moment. A subject anticipating lethal violence is instead presented with a formalized dialogue by an organized crime syndicate. It enforces a vital psychiatric truth. Our perception of human control is merely a fragile cognitive construct. Stick with me as we examine the psychological pivot. Lena, struggling for oxygen, demands target identification. Dante maintains a flat affect, referencing the affluent subject she served prior. He proposes a controlled environment to discuss her vulnerability. Lena immediately reinstates her denial protocol, rejecting the existence of any issue. However, Dante employs tactical empathy combined with intelligence disclosure. He enumerates the clinical evidence, the concealed hematomas, the financial exploitation, and the probability of an imminent fatal incident. This psychological dismantling is more devastating than physical force. Her classified trauma has been completely audited by a foreign entity. The reality is undeniable. Regardless of the defense mechanisms erected to conceal abuse, behavioral pathology will inevitably leak into the observable world. Dante frames the intervention as a rescue metric. Lena exhibits hostile disbelief, questioning why a high-status entity would focus on an insignificant subject. A black sedan breaches the perimeter and Adrian Castellano emerges. His biomechanics display extreme territorial dominance, yet his micro-expressions register unresolved grief. This duality is a hallmark of the megalomaniac narcissist, projecting absolute power while harboring deep psychological wounds. He articulates her name with clinical precision and apologizes for the coercive extraction. When challenged with the accusation of predatory surveillance, Adrian refuses to employ deflection. He issues a stark affirmative confirmation. This radical transparency is a calculated weapon, injecting pure, unmitigated truth into a manipulated psyche can instantly bypass years of established cognitive barriers. The subject, experiencing mild shock, demands his core motivation. Adrian closes the physical distance. Notably, Lena's flinch reflex is absent, a clear preliminary indicator of Stockholm Syndrome. He states his objective, providing external validation of her suffering. He clinically dissects her environment, exposing the domestic volatility, the fabricated medical alibis, and the financial drain of subsidizing her abuser. He systematically dismantles her cognitive dissonance until her psychological baseline is entirely exposed. She seeks the transactional variable, asking what currency he requires. His response is a zero-sum declaration. No compensation is expected. As behavioral analysts, we understand human interactions are fundamentally transactional, yet a profoundly damaged psyche will interpret this calculated manipulation as altruism, mistakenly identifying an apex predator as a benevolent savior. Adrian outlines a threat neutralization protocol, guaranteeing lethal consequences should the primary abuser initiate contact. Lena probes his underlying psychological drive. Adrian discloses his formative childhood trauma. He details a 15-year cycle of domestic violence endured by his mother, describing the dualistic nature of his father, the caretaker who transitioned into a localized terror source. The critical incident occurred when the mother attempted an extraction, resulting in her public execution by the father. Adrian, at age 12, was a direct witness to this familial homicide. This origin story provides the bedrock for his megalomaniacal complex. The clinical takeaway is exceptionally grim. The biological structures designed to ensure our basic physical security often harbor the exact predators who will ultimately execute our destruction. The subject exhibits a tear response. Issuing a verbal apology, Adrian maintains prolonged eye contact, operating from his unresolved traumatic imprinting. His developmental years were defined by a powerless desire for a dominant interventionist. Having acquired that power, his pathology demands he recreate and resolve the original scenario. He presents her with a binary choice: regress to the abuse cycle and await the inevitability of death, or enter his vehicle and initiate a total erasure of her previous life. His syndicate will execute the containment. You and I must analyze the gravity of this moment. He is offering a complete systemic reset. It serves as a stark behavioral principle. Occasionally, the only viable method of surviving a hostile environment is to surrender your defensive autonomy and permit a more lethal predator to eliminate your immediate threat. Let us open this case file together. Adrian leans across the table, offering an escape fueled by ruthless power. Lena searches his face, unable to comprehend why a crime boss would intervene. "Because I can," he whispers, projecting the trauma of his dead mother onto this stranger, the hallmark of a megalomaniac narcissist. She closes her eyes, battling suffocating memories of Eric and his violent outbursts. Clinical observation shows us that survival instinct forces a subject to grasp the hand pulling them into the dark. She exhales a broken plea. Adrian gives a heavy nod of absolute control, telling her to pack only what matters. The lesson is stark. True survival sometimes demands we align with the darkness to finally escape it. Acute terror manifests physically in her throat as she visualizes the sheer violence of Eric returning. Yet Adrian remains completely detached, his face illuminated by a pale screen. 2 hours, he murmurs, exhibiting the calculated tracking of a sociopath monitoring his prey. Knowing the schedule of a monster should freeze the blood, yet for Lena, it operates as a psychological sedative. The enforcer, Dante, holds the heavy car door. She takes a ragged breath and steps into her apartment. Every punched hole in the drywall serves as a violent diagnostic marker of her chronic abuse. The clinical reality of human psychology is that a patient can never truly heal within the exact same toxic environment that poisoned them. Dante stands as a silent sentinel while she blindly packs. The subject discards the debris of her fractured life, gathering only grounding objects: a worn sweater, a photo album from the era before her abuser dismantled her ego. Stepping into the bathroom, the harsh lighting forces a confrontation with her reflection. She freezes. The superficial barrier of makeup is fading, revealing the raw edge of a fresh contusion. For the first time in 2 years, she leaves the cosmetic concealment untouched, allowing the physical manifestation of her trauma to remain visible. We must always remember that masking our deepest wounds will never cure the underlying psychological infection. Dee delivers a 10-minute warning from the hall. Lena stares at the couch where she endured systemic abuse, finally turning her back on the broken woman she used to be. Examine this critical behavioral juncture. 3 blocks away, the sterile silence of the vehicle shatters with a sudden vibration. The name of her abuser illuminates the cabin like a toxic stimulus, instantly triggering the ingrained panic response in her eyes. Her thumb hovers over the screen, paralyzed by years of conditioned Stockholm syndrome, terrified of defying her captor. Then, the enforcer cuts through the paralysis. "You owe that monster nothing," Dante murmurs. The device screams into voicemail, then initiates another frantic cycle. Overcoming her conditioning, Lena severs the connection, plunging the screen into total blackness. We observe quickly that completely cutting a trauma bond is the only true path back to baseline sanity. They arrive at a secure facility to hide. We see the subject placed in a highly controlled environment, devoid of previous triggers. She engages the heavy deadbolt, creating a profound psychological barricade. Sinking into the upholstery, she anticipates the inevitable neurological wave of panic and the conditioned guilt whispering she made an error. But the autonomic snarkstorm never arrives. Later, the megalomaniac narcissist enters the space, his predatory aura deliberately masked. "How are you holding up?" Adrian asks, using artificial empathy. She reports a profound somatic ache. "You have been running on pure terror." He diagnoses accurately. Human behavior shows us that a subject never truly realizes the crushing weight of their psychological burden until they are safely permitted to set it down. Adrian slides an operational blueprint across the desk, promising swift legal severing and hidden assets. Yet the subject remains anchored to her trauma bond, her voice trembling as she inquires about her abuser. Adrian shifts into a dominant pathology, murmuring that Eric is being managed, and further contact would be a fatal error. Hearing a criminal figure issue a lethal directive should induce panic, but the subject exhibits paradoxical relief. It remains a stark behavioral truth that neutralizing an ingrained threat often requires the intervention of a far darker pathology. She offers a fragile expression of gratitude, which he clinically dismisses. When she questions his motive for defending a stranger, the narcissist freezes entirely. A sudden grief bleeds into his dark eyes. You and I must look closely at this psychological fracture. Adrian's emotional suppression fails as he details a severe childhood trauma. He recounts hiding in a closet at 12 years old, experiencing total powerlessness while his father murdered his mother. His criminal empire is merely a compensatory mechanism for that failure to protect. Lena observes this in stunned silence, realizing the predator is driven by an unhealed inner child. It demonstrates how our most catastrophic foundational traumas often forge our rigid adult purposes. When she offers empathetic validation, he abruptly blocks it, refusing any pity. He demands only to function as the impenetrable barrier his mother was violently denied. The vulnerability vanishes instantly. Tomorrow, they finally go to war. As his hand grips the hardware, the subject's conditioned anxiety compels her to offer financial restitution. Adrian pauses, his rigid features relaxing. His clinical requirement is singular. He demands only her continued survival. Left in isolation, Lena paces the perimeter of the secure environment. She exhibits tactile grounding, running her fingers over crisp linens and the heavy steel of the locking mechanism. It is fascinating how standard comforts become absolute miracles to a mind subjected to chronic deprivation. Stepping into a scalding shower, her emotional containment protocols finally collapse. 2 years of sustained terror physically evacuate her nervous system. In our analysis, we see that simply granting oneself permission to truly rest is the ultimate behavioral victory. The circadian shift brings morning illumination into the space. Upon waking, the subject experiences a brief cognitive delay before her brain floods her with the preceding events. She exhibits a freeze response, scanning the environment for auditory triggers. Complete silence, no aggressive footfalls, no sounds of substance abuse. Her disabled communication device remains dormant, containing the erratic oscillation between her abuser's manic apologies and homicidal threats. It is a clinical reality that abusers weaponize a victim's inherent empathy to maintain the parameters of their psychological cage. But her physical relocation finally breaks the toxic loop. Investigating the wardrobe, she discovers fresh garments, representing a tangible, undeniable variable of absolute safety. The narcissist engineered her daily existence with disturbing precision. A sterile dental instrument waits by the basin, and nutritional supplies are calibrated perfectly. As the subject engages in basic tasks, she registers a profound absence of physical distress. True psychological rehabilitation begins when the nervous system can finally regulate itself during mundane routines. This baseline state is interrupted by 3 measured impacts on the door. The enforcer introduces a secondary asset, Catherine, a legal operative projecting psychopathic traits of her own. She initiates contact with a steady gesture, her vocal tone entirely flat as she questions the subject's readiness to legally terminate the marriage. The finality of that terminology acts as a sudden psychological accelerant. Pay close attention as you and I are about to observe the escalation of this conflict. The subject regulates her respiration, verbalizing her consent. The operative deposits a dense file, converting the chronic data of Lena's domestic torture into a tactical legal weapon. The victim's ocular movements become erratic, demonstrating residual paranoia as she questions the efficacy of this shield. Catherine delivers the parameters with sociopathic calm. The legal boundary is immediate, carrying the threat of systemic incarceration. Yet Lena understands her abuser's pathology. He will predictably escalate to extreme violence rather than submit. A vital therapeutic principle emerges here. A victim must surround themselves with apex predators to survive the volatile fallout of their initial escape. Let us dissect this final maneuver together. The operative explains that integrating Adrian into this equation fundamentally shatters the dominant delusion of the abuser. Civil documents provide minimal deterrence, but the shadow of a syndicate communicates in the only primitive dialect the abuser comprehends: absolute lethal dominance. As this variable is introduced, the involuntary tremors in the subject's extremities cease. A detached tranquility overtakes her. For 2 intensive hours, They extract the forensic anatomy of her trauma. Faded medical records transition from passive markers of victimization into aggressive instruments of war. We are left with a stark clinical certainty. The very injuries inflicted to enforce submission frequently evolve into the lethal mechanisms that ensure a victim's ultimate liberation. In my clinical evaluations, I often see what Lena is experiencing here. Asked for police records, she shows textbook avoidance, pinned by internalized shame. Her attorney displays pure clinical detachment, smoothly asking for witnesses instead. Lena briefly remembers a kind waitress, but the isolation of chronic abuse takes hold. Her neighbors heard the shattered glass and midnight screams, yet they succumbed to the bystander effect, choosing apathy. The lawyer quietly closes the folder, issuing a brutal diagnosis of human behavior. This reveals a deeply necessary truth about survival. You can never expect the collective crowd to act as your personal shield. When violence arrives at your threshold, ordinary people will simply lock their doors. The attorney addresses Lena's trauma bond with surgical precision. She notes that Eric destroyed their marriage the moment his violence began. We are witnessing a clinical autopsy of a relationship that expired long ago. By morning, an injunction will form a barrier against her abuser. The safety protocols are absolute. Stay inside, cut ties, and disappear. The victim must become a ghost. However, the traumatized brain resists sudden severing. Driven by intense compulsion, Lena grabs her dead phone. She holds it like an explosive, overwhelmed by a morbid need to observe his narcissistic collapse. This illustrates a vital truth about human recovery. Escaping the physical proximity of a toxic environment is only the first step. The genuine battle lies in breaking your psychological addiction to the flames. Let us analyze this moment together. The compulsion wins, and Lena powers on the device. The screen illuminates Eric's pathological rage, 47 missed calls, 32 frantic texts. Recognizing his escalating volatility, she kills the power. She spends the afternoon dissociating, drifting through the safe house, processing the strange shock of safety after years of domestic captivity. Yet, her focus remains fixed on the crime boss, Adrian. Clinically speaking, an apex predator does not deploy vast resources to save a random civilian without a deeply rooted motive. This introduces a profound rule of survival for all of us. Whenever a sudden rescue appears entirely flawless, you must immediately begin calculating the invisible toll it will inevitably demand. Watch this traumatized mind shift into clinical paranoia. Lena sits motionless, agonizing over Adrian's unseen agenda. His failure to demand any concession is precisely what triggers her panic. To her, this absence of a transaction is far more alarming than Eric's familiar cruelty. Her previous abuse was horrific, but it had a predictable economy. She endured violence as currency to purchase survival. This syndicate leader operates on an entirely foreign axis. When his subordinate brings food and mentions, "The boss will visit tonight," a glacial panic floods her nervous system. This highlights an unsettling truth about human psychology. The unearned benevolence of a powerful stranger often feels vastly more terrifying than the predictable brutality of the devil you already know. Before Dante leaves, Lena stops him, asking his tenure with the boss to establish a psychological baseline. 8 years, he says. She asks if Adrian secretly runs a sanctuary for broken people. Dante delivers a clinical assessment. Adrian follows a highly unorthodox moral compass, capable of total salvation or absolute destruction, yet his word is an ironclad contract. Dante promises her safety and vanishes. Left alone, Lena wrestles with severe cognitive dissonance. Why would a massive criminal syndicate mobilize merely to shield one woman from an abusive husband? This perfectly encapsulates a profound life lesson. We spend so much of our time frantically fleeing from wolves that we fail to question why a tiger just offered us a quiet place in his den. Adrian arrives at 8, instantly altering the pressure of the room. Stripped of his corporate armor, his dark clothing amplifies his predatory nature. He takes a seat, maintaining a strict clinical distance. He confirms the divorce proceedings are moving, but when discussing Eric, the boss's tone drops to absolute zero. He details a surveillance network bordering on omniscience. Every single move her former husband makes is being actively monitored by the syndicate. For a healthy individual, this predatory tracking would trigger severe alarm. But for Lena, it washes over her traumatized nervous system like a warm baptism of security. The psychological takeaway here is stark but universally true. When you spend years drowning in the unpredictable chaos of an abuser, a sudden measure of dark, authoritarian control feels exactly like a lifesaver. The tension fractures, and Lena finally breaks. She demands to understand the psychological architecture of a man manipulating the underworld. Adrian goes perfectly still. You see his cold calculation before he drops the mask. He confesses to ruling a massive syndicate, blending corporate structures with illicit operations. When Lena labels him a criminal, his resting heart rate never spikes. He prefers the term businessman, one who bypasses inconvenient legislation. He asks if proximity to his darkness will trigger her flight response. Instead, Lena's mind flashes to the apathetic police who repeatedly failed her. This forces us to confront a bitter truth. Playing by the rules means absolutely nothing when the designated good guys continuously leave you bleeding on the floor. Let's look at this piece by piece. Weighing the systemic failure of the police, Lena exhibits a spike in confidence. She states his criminal status is irrelevant. A fleeting micro-expression alters the boss's face. He admits his surprise that she bypassed moral outrage. But Lena's psychological reserves are depleted by the empty theater of the high ground. She exhausted every legal avenue, only to find the system enabling her abuser. She delivers a devastating truth. This crime boss provided more sanctuary in 2 days than the law managed in 2 years. Adrian stays silent, analyzing her trauma-induced resilience. This reveals a very uncomfortable life lesson. The legally correct avenue and actual safety are rarely the same thing. Sometimes, your only ticket to true salvation wears the mask of a villain. Stick with me. This is where the dynamic shifts. Lena asks the essential question, what is his strategic objective? Adrian answers with the chilling detachment of a tactician. They will deploy the legal order and observe Eric's behavioral fallout. Lena asks what happens if her abuser descends into violent madness. Adrian doesn't blink, coldly promising to escalate and neutralize the threat. Before exiting, Lena asks the question haunting her logic. In a city of broken lives, why did he elect to save hers? The untouchable crime boss physically freezes. For a fragile second, the mastermind looks unmoored, unable to intellectualize his own sudden mercy. This highlights a profound life lesson. We constantly try to force clinical logic onto a chaotic universe, but our most massive human connections stem from pure, irrational instinct. In the dim light, the armor of the crime boss cracks. He confesses to observing her at the restaurant, noting the paralyzing terror behind her trauma response smile. In that moment, his hardened psychology fractured. Walking away ceased to be an option. Watching his vehicle dissolve into shadows, Lena realizes her survival is tethered to an underworld sovereign. Paradoxically, this brings a deep sense of security, but Dawn shatters that peace. Her attorney calls, the judge signed the documents, and police officially served Eric. Immediately, a somatic dread twists her stomach into knots. The storm is here. Let us absorb an essential clinical truth together. The precise second a narcissistic abuser comprehends the evaporation of duration of their control is the exact moment their capacity for violence reaches its terrifying zenith. The police gave Eric a standard ultimatum: violate the order, face jail. But as the phone goes dead, a terrifying clinical realization crystallizes. Megalomaniacs do not bow to paper mandates. Paralyzing dread locks Lena's joints. You feel that suffocating shift when a psychological storm upgrades. Someone with his pathology will never passively sign away his possession. Within his corrupted mind, Lena is not a partner. She is property. The morning stretches into a sensory torture chamber. She tries to move, but his shadow suffocates her cognitive function. By midday, Dante knocks with grave updates. This brings a brutal reality into focus, serving as a vital lesson. Escaping the physical grip of a toxic environment is never the conclusion. It is merely the prologue to a vastly more dangerous psychological war. Let us examine this clinical file together. Dante drops a bag on the table, his facial effect entirely flattened. He delivers the precipitating stressor. Eric is actively hunting Lena, interrogating the local underbelly. Lena exhibits immediate autonomic arousal, panic overriding her executive function. Suddenly, the landline shatters the silence. Note her fixation on the receiver. Nobody has this number. On the fourth ring, trauma compulsion drives her hand to answer. It is Eric. His speech is slurred as he demands answers about the papers. She begs to know how he tracked her, but he only issues a cold command to return. The most terrifying predators do not hide in shadows. They spend years mapping the exact architecture of your psychological vulnerabilities. Watch closely how the domestic psychopath operates. Eric initiates a fabricated apology tour, swearing they can repair the damage, but Lena breaks the cycle, declaring the relationship permanently severed. His response is a chilling laugh that strips away his mask of sanity. He hisses that she does not dictate the terms, his vocal pitch hitting the precise frequency that precedes physical violence. He clinically reasserts that she is his property. Dante enters, signaling her to terminate the connection. Accessing a rare spark of ego strength, Lena tells Eric to stay away and slams the receiver down. When it rings again, Dante rips the cord from the drywall. They trace the burner. True courage is not the absence of terror. It is the willpower to disconnect while the abuser actively attempts to rewire your reality. The trace points directly to Eric's territory. Dante shifts into a purely mechanical state, issuing rapid evacuation commands. They are relocating to the personal estate of Adrian Castellano, a fortified compound outside city limits. Lena suffers from severe adrenal fatigue. Her conscious mind wants to stand and fight, but the echoing memory of Eric's threats triggers a severe flight response. Her fine motor skills fail, hands trembling violently as she packs, while Dante issues tactical orders. Minutes later, they speed north in a black sedan, abandoning the urban grid for a perimeter of heavy iron gates. We must acknowledge a bitter psychological reality here. When escaping a relentless predator, you rarely find genuine freedom. Survival often dictates trading your current nightmare for a beautiful cage with far heavier locks. Observe the intimidating security perimeter. It broadcasts a clear message. The owner possesses the capital to purchase total isolation, and the violence to maintain it. Dante escorts inside to meet Rosa, the housekeeper. Lena is directed up a sweeping staircase into a master suite designed to dwarf its occupant. The luxury here is functionally aggressive. Experiencing acute sensory overload, Lena whispers that the space is entirely too much. Rosa simply notes that Castellano never operates in half measures. Left alone, Lena collapses onto the mattress, her hypervigilant brain completely unable to power down. There is a deeply unsettling reality regarding complex trauma. When a subject has spent years of a reason for emotional impact, stepping into a heavily guarded environment feels exactly like walking into a perfectly baited trap. Consider the severe cognitive whiplash here. 72 hours ago, Lena was peeling herself off a freezing tile floor. Now she occupies a stronghold, protected by a crime kingpin to a homicidal spouse. Adrian enters the frame. His posture is relaxed, but his gaze holds predatory calculation. He assures her the structure is an impenetrable vault. Lena exhibits tremors, insisting Eric will never terminate his pursuit. Adrian encroaches on her personal space, his imposing affect draining the oxygen. He delivers a sociopathic guarantee. Eric will learn the consequences of touching property belonging to Adrian Castellano. That extreme ownership is a textbook red flag. Yet survival psychology dictates a brutal logic. Victim must often enlist a significantly larger monster merely to keep the everyday wolves at bay. Analyze the shifting parameters of possession here. Eric relied on coercive control, where Adrian's megalomaniac narcissism projects the heavy security of a titanium shield. When Lena states she is not his property, Adrian validates her with a calm nod. He explains that within his antisocial subculture, protecting a civilian mandates a public declaration of ownership to deter rival aggression. She questions his exact methodology regarding her husband. Adrian deploys a calculated silence. He softly guarantees to demonstrate how narrow Eric's survival options have become. He either signs the documents or meets a violent end. Lena registers zero moral revulsion at this proposed murder, experiencing only profound physiological relief. A crucial distinction emerges here. A fist raised to dominate is psychologically entirely different from a weapon drawn to enforce your physical safety. This is where the psychological profile gets complex. You and I will examine this pivotal escalation together. Notice Lena's spiking cortisol levels as Adrian states the neutralization will occur tonight. He classifies Eric as an unstable variable needing immediate removal. Lena pleads with this organized killer to spare her abuser's life. A flicker of cognitive dissonance crosses Adrian's sociopathic stare. Lena consciously rejects the transfer of trauma. Her stability depends on maintaining moral superiority over her tormentors. Adrian processes the immense weight of her request, and in a rare deviation from his baseline, he concedes. He allows the target to live, but ensures Eric understands his survival hinges entirely on Lena's mercy. True psychological dominance is often demonstrated by withholding destruction when you possess the absolute capacity to execute it. Adrian locks visual contact, testing her psychological resolve. He states that once the sequence begins, the trajectory is irreversible. He outlines a rigid boundary. The abuser receives a single warning. Any future aggression toward Lena will trigger immediate, permanent termination. Lena supplies an involuntary nod. Adrian exits, issuing lethal directives over his device. Returning, his facial muscles are rigid, displaying zero empathy. He explicitly rejects her gratitude, categorizing Eric as a parasite unworthy of emotional expenditure. Yet, Lena's hypervigilance detects a profound deviation. This apex predator actively suppressed his violent compulsions solely to stabilize her nervous system. In a rapid trauma bond response, she impulsively requests he remain for a meal. Even the most damaged psychological specimens instinctively seek a brief reprieve from their own internal carnage. Observe this environmental shift. The dining area is unlit, focusing attention on the solitary light above the table. Adrian, an individual constructed of defensive aggression, exhibits a micro-expression of shock at Lena's request for proximity. The sociopathic mask fractures, exposing repressed trauma. They sit in silence. Historically, quiet signaled the immediate escalation of Eric's abuse. Tonight, it acts as a parasympathetic reset. She carefully inquires about his mother. Adrian ceases eating, his gaze dissociating as he accesses buried grief. He details a maternal profile characterized by fatal empathy, a woman whose pathological need to rehabilitate violent men resulted in her destruction. The clinical takeaway is absolute. Attempting to use your empathy to reconstruct an irrevocably fractured psyche will only ensure your own obliteration. Notice the physical tension in Adrian's knuckles gripping the glass. His vocal register drops, articulating the clinical failure of his mother's hypothesis. Emotional attachment cannot rewire antisocial personality traits. Within this controlled environment, Stockholm Syndrome rapidly solidifies into a mutual trauma bond. He verbalizes that her memory serves as his psychological anchor, the sole inhibitory mechanism preventing total psychopathy. This apex criminal constructed a syndicate of deterrence specifically to compensate for the systemic failure that allowed his mother's demise. Lena initiates physical contact, validating that his mother would revere his protective adaptations. It is a severe psychological paradox. The human mind frequently constructs its most impenetrable defense mechanisms using the same traumatic materials that originally caused its structural collapse. Observe the spatial dynamics of this interaction. Lena decreases physical distance, displaying a psychological need to categorize this crime leader as an agent of justice rather than a clinical sociopath. Adrian maintains passive observation, fully aware of the cognitive distortions required to maintain that artificial moral boundary. Yet his defensive posturing degrades, revealing complementary attachment trauma. A significant neurological shift occurs within Lena. For the first time in her timeline, the constant calculation of escape routes ceases. Her nervous system finally achieves homeostasis. Adrian terminates the session, issuing a binding directive to neutralize the narcissistic ex-husband tomorrow, ensuring her security. Recovery does not follow a linear pathway. You and I understand that the most terrifying psychological hurdle is often granting the mind permission to dismantle its hypervigilance and simply exist. Shift focus to the urban grid below. The clinical outcome is predictable. Eric is undergoing a severe narcissistic injury, confronting the absolute termination of his coercive control. In the elevated stronghold, Lena enters a REM cycle within the heavily reinforced perimeter of a megalomaniac. However, the psychiatric cost of enlisting an antisocial personality as a protective proxy is massive. She remains unconscious of the psychological debt actively compounding in Adrian's ledger. At 3 a.m, the illusion of stability collapses. The traumatized brain is neurologically conditioned to reject prolonged peace. Elevated voices penetrate the lower levels, and Dante breaches the upper quadrant, his face visibly pale from acute shock. This is the brutal reality of cyclical trauma. The sensory experience of safety is often merely a brief intermission before the mind is violently thrust back into the prevailing chaos. We open the case file on Lena. Her physiological panic is acute, demanding answers before Dante even speaks. The trigger is severe. Her abusive husband is stabilized in a hospital bed. Terror floods her nervous system as she questions the violence they deployed. Dante clinically reports they simply answered Eric with the physical currency he requested. This megalomaniac narcissist is awake, immediately weaponizing his trauma and threatening media exposure. Downstairs, Adrian watches this fallout with the detached calm of an apex predator. The physical damage is minimal, merely broken ribs and a fractured wrist. But you and I know this highlights a grim truth of abusive pathology. Escaping a toxic cycle never yields a ceasefire. The invisible warfare simply shifts to a new battleground until one psyche is destroyed. Adrian exhibits the flattened affect of a syndicate operator. He explains the warning was administered precisely to plan, but Eric is blinded by the ego of a classic megalomaniac narcissist. He spat at the enforcers, screaming vows to hunt Lena down. The broken bones were a clinical behavioral correction, translating threats into physical consequences. Adrian fixes his heavy gaze on, ensuring she processes that he kept his promise to leave the subject breathing. In this underworld, a verbal threat is a binding contract. Lena collapses into a chair, trembling at the thought of Eric manipulating the authorities. Adrian remains unfazed by the police. The true horror is the pathology of obsession. A toxic individual will gladly sink their own ship just to ensure you drown alongside them. A rational brain interprets shattered ribs as a biological signal to retreat. But Lena understands the twisted machinery of her former captor. She whispers a clinical truth. Eric is not acting out of bravery. He is experiencing a narcissistic collapse because his authority has been stripped away. When a chronic controller loses their grip, their descent into madness is incredibly swift. Lena is certain he will keep hunting her. In response, Adrian solidifies into an immovable force, vowing Eric will never touch her again. He grows entirely still, the dormant predator rising just behind his calculated gaze. If the subject refuses to yield, Adrian will simply erase him from the equation. We must recognize this grim reality. Sometimes outlasting a monster requires untethering a far deadlier beast. Her psyche, deeply scarred by trauma, recognizes a bitter certainty. You cannot negotiate with a malignant narcissist. Lena confesses her reluctance to see anyone lowered into the earth, yet her behavioral conditioning as the prey is breaking. Adrian steps closer, embodying a fascinating psychiatric paradox. He is both lethal danger and profound sanctuary. He assures her it will not escalate to murder, though the gravel in his tone suggests a different contingency plan. In his ruthless worldview, Eric ignited this war the moment he struck her. Any fatal consequence is the logical harvest of his own planting. Adrian clinically dismisses the authority, if he entirely. To him, the law is an abstract construct. He is the physical barrier. It is a sobering lesson. Highly toxic individuals are immune to the concept of a peaceful resolution. Analyze the framing of this dynamic. Abusers molded in Eric's narcissistic image never gracefully exit the stage. Their pathology demands they escalate violence until a superior force breaks their momentum. Adrian operates as that immovable wall. Lena studies his face, actively wrestling with cognitive dissonance. How can the gentleman from dinner be the same syndicate boss orchestrating brutality? By clinical logic, she should be repulsed. Yet, she finds psychological comfort in his absolute control. His gentleness and violence are merely distinct instruments used to keep her breathing. When Lena confesses her terror, Adrian validates her nervous system, noting fear is the ultimate biological survival instinct. He takes her hand, offering a grounding touch that asks for absolutely nothing in return. True salvation often arrives wearing a terrifying psychological mask. Adrian anchors her hand in the dark, offering himself as an eclipse against her monster. The psychological gravity of his underworld pulls at Lena, surrendering to it. Much like the dependency seen in Stockholm Syndrome, would be effortless yet dangerous to her autonomy. Recognizing this transference, she withdraws her fingers. Adrian accepts the physical boundary with zero clinical judgment, noting they will wait for her ex to make a move at dawn. Lena offers gratitude that he restrained his lethal instincts, aware that leaving Eric alive complicates their tactical board. Adrian replies that every meaningful endeavor is messy. Left alone, Lena stares at the ceiling, processing her severe hypervigilance. The true burden of outlasting trauma is not fleeing the inferno. It is sitting in the quiet aftermath, waiting for the neurological embers to stop burning. Morning bleeds through the curtains, illuminating Lena's paradox. She exists in a secure sanctuary that reeks of impending violence. Her cortisol levels remain elevated, so she abandons sleep and finds Rosa downstairs. Lena clinically confesses the crushing weight of her anxiety. Rosa slides a warm mug across the counter, revealing a behavioral observation. Adrian has not anchored his guarded psyche to another human this deeply in years. Lena attempts to rationalize and dismiss the notion, citing the brief timeline of their acquaintance. Rosa smiles, sharing the dark history of her own sister, who was psychologically imprisoned by a violent partner until the boss intervened. This exposes a profound psychiatric reality. Shared trauma possesses its own distinct vocabulary. It bypasses normal social bonding entirely, instantly transforming broken strangers into fiercely loyal allies. Rosa details how her sister wore a physical map of blunt force trauma until Adrian observed the pattern. His behavioral response was absolute. The abusive husband was permanently deleted from the equation, allowing her sister space for recovery. When Lena questions his fate, Rosa offers a dismissive shrug. Plausible deniability is the ultimate safety net here. Adrian is an architect of permanent solutions. The narcissistic Eric only draws breath because Lena serves as a moral restraint. She asks Rosa if she should finally slip that psychological leash and let Adrian neutralize the threat. Rosa replies with clinical wisdom. We must all integrate the weight of our choices, but certain malignant personalities demand surgical removal. Dante then enters, his body language screaming defeat. True preservation of peace sometimes demands severing a necrotic branch so the host can survive. Dante shatters the baseline calm with a devastating variable. Eric abandoned his medical care, slipping into the urban grid to evade surveillance. Lena's fine motor skills fail. The silver fork drops as cold dread floods her system. A cornered megalomaniac is drafting a counter-offensive. Dante validates this hypothesis, sliding a phone across the table to expose Eric's digital warfare. The abuser is broadcasting a fabricated narrative, publicly claiming his wife was abducted. Lena begs to have the data scrubbed, but Dante declines. Eric is actively constructing a psychological shield. If he is neutralized now, he becomes a public martyr. You and I must recognize this classic manipulation tactic. The most lethal tool a toxic individual wields is the brazen ability to invert reality, erasing their own cruelty to crown themselves the tragic victim. We understand the erratic violence of a cornered subject, yet Adrian steps in, administering a freezing dose of tactical logic. If Eric is allowed to play the martyr, utilizing blunt force to silence him will validate his fiction. The crime boss outlines a brilliant psychological checkmate. The strategy is to feed the abuser the precise dopamine hit he craves, a highly controlled confrontation. Dante protests, unwilling to place Lena back in the line of fire, but Adrian observes the behavioral chessboard. Eric must visually process Lena standing unbroken, a cognitive shock that incinerates his false reality. It is a vital clinical lesson in surviving manipulation. Granting an adversary the temporary illusion of control is often the exact mechanism required to spring a flawless trap. Lena listens in silence, her elevated pulse hammering against her ribs. Let us examine this behavioral shift together. We observe Lena, somatic nausea, twisting her stomach at the prospect of sharing oxygen with her primary abuser. Yet the cold logic of Adrian's clinical strategy is inescapable. She must deconstruct Eric's delusions herself. She volunteers, the confirmation tumbling from her pale lips before the adrenaline evaporates. Dante protests, but Lena understands that pathological obsession does not organically fade. She locks eyes with Adrian, negotiating boundaries by demanding he remain in the shadows as a lethal guardian. They select a populated cafe, transforming a neutral public arena into a monitored psychiatric stage. Here is a vital lesson for your own survival. Sometimes, the only effective method to strip a monster of its power is to drag it directly into the unforgiving glare of broad daylight. They will force Eric's truth into the open. We transition to the tactical preparation. Dante maps the physical exits, while Adrian commands the psychological space. The boss understands raw violence, yet prefers the chilling elegance of absolute control. For Lena, the anticipatory hours drag, violently spiking her cortisol. She is clinically terrified of the unhinged beast lurking behind Eric's narcissistic mask. By nightfall, her nervous system is fraying. She stands trembling in the garden. Adrian materializes from the shadows, his voice a calming rumble, analyzing if her psychological load is too heavy. She admits her terror, but accepts the necessity of facing the monster. When she asks if Eric will physically hurt her, Adrian offers zero sweet illusions. Here is a tragic but vital clinical lesson. Deeply fractured individuals will forever crave the sick dopamine thrill of breaking another human being simply to synthesize a fleeting illusion of internal power. Let us examine Adrian's clinical micro-expressions. He diagnoses Eric as a coward reliant on the illusion of control. When Lena questions him, her voice shaking from trauma, Adrian exhibits textbook megalomania. He makes an absolute vow of protection. Notice the psychological transference. Her abuser shattered her defenses, leaving her primed for Stockholm Syndrome. She looks at a known criminal orchestrator and accepts him as her savior. Adrian validates her terror, murmuring that confronting the fire is true courage. Observe the vital clinical truth in this dynamic. Genuine resilience is not the absence of neurological panic, but taking action while the nervous system is in full revolt. They try to eat, but her severe autonomic arousal renders the dinner completely tasteless. Adrian attempts to construct a baseline of normalcy by discussing estate renovations, yet his predatory gaze tracks her every reaction. Lena disrupts this baseline, asking if he will experience remorse if forced to eliminate Eric. Observe the sociopathic clarity in his response. He claims abstract regret for violence, but feels absolute zero moral hesitation regarding her protection. He freely admits to a behavioral history that would psychologically destroy a normal civilian. You and I must understand the clinical mechanism at play. Deep attachment often means absorbing profound psychological darkness to shield the object of your fixation. Because Adrian has classified her as an essential in-group member, he is fully prepared to execute lethal force with zero cognitive dissonance. Notice the critical shift in her trauma response. Adrian communicates a complete lack of remorse regarding the potential murder of her abuser. A healthy psyche would distance itself from a man who views violence as a mere transaction. Instead, Lena's cortisol levels visibly drop. She rationalizes his antisocial traits. Stating his danger serves a protective function. This is textbook Stockholm Syndrome, rebranding a predator as a guardian. The behavioral lesson is striking. The perception of core intent can entirely override objective, moral failings in the mind of a victim. They finish their meal in a state of psychological homeostasis. He instructs her to rest before the impending confrontation. However, displaying clear, anxious attachment, she reaches out and firmly grips his arm. She expresses gratitude, shocked he considers her worth the risk. You and I recognize this common symptom of prolonged abuse, the internalized belief that one is a fundamental burden. Adrian counters this, dropping his rigid affect to state she simply required assistance. A vital psychological principle emerges here. Healthy support systems do not pathologize a person as being too difficult to manage. Overnight, Lena's PTSD manifests in severe night terrors. By dawn, Rosa provides a measured dose of maternal stability. Lena selects form-fitting garments to eliminate tactical grip points for her abuser, leaving her facial contusions visible. It is a calculated display of psychological defiance. Downstairs, her new criminal benefactors stand ready for organized violence. Adrian dictates parameters with the cold precision of a tactician. He instructs her to terminate the interaction instantly if Eric exhibits emotional dysregulation. He reinforces a critical cognitive reframe. She is not indebted to her former captor. No closure. No conditioned apologies. The foundational lesson in trauma recovery is clear. A victim has zero moral obligation to provide a soft landing for their abuser. They enter the cafe. The enforcer, Dante, visually sweeps the space for threats. Eric occupies a corner. His face displays severe trauma from his recent miscalculation. Stripped of his domestic authority, the man who once controlled her entire reality is now physically diminished. His nervous system betrays him. His hands visibly shake as he stands. We observe a milestone in her recovery. Lena overrides her fear response, holding unblinking eye contact. Eric uses a compliment to re-establish dominance. She neutralizes it, stating her safety is secure. He mocks her reliance on a crime boss to provoke shame. Lena clinically reframes it as survival. You and I recognize this textbook manipulation cycle. Eric initiates the contrition phase, fabricating remorse to repair their bond. Lena remains entirely emotionally detached. She points out his fundamental pathology. Noting his dysfunction destroys everything he touches. The diagnostic truth is unyielding. Empathy alone cannot cure a malignant personality disorder. After 2 agonizing years of failed rehabilitation, she is permanently severing the parasitic attachment. Lena maintains her psychological armor, declaring her escape a true victory. Eric lowers his vocal register to synthesize false intimacy, appealing to the sunk cost fallacy. He begs her not to abandon their history. Lena deconstructs this delusion, citing the empirical data of his abuse, defensive sleeping arrangements, and concealing physical trauma. Eric suffers a catastrophic narcissistic collapse. His facade of repentance evaporates into raw hostility. He attempts a cognitive distortion, projecting blame onto her association with the crime boss. The psychological axiom holds firm: a cornered narcissist will always rewrite reality to position themselves as the injured victim. Lena flatly rejects his manipulation, stating his violence is the sole reason for her departure. Lena's flat effect confirms the dissolution of their bond, triggering a total loss of impulse control in Eric. He grabs her wrist, vocalizing his delusion of ownership. Adrian instantly initiates a lethal threat response, but Lena issues a non-verbal command to halt him. Eric sneers, suggesting Adrian will become her next abuser. Lena delivers a devastating reality check, calmly informing him that his continued biological function is solely due to her explicit mercy. The clinical takeaway is paramount. Never misinterpret a trauma survivor's restraint as inherent weakness. She violently reclaims her arm, issuing a terminal boundary warning. If he ever breaches her proximity again, his existence will be permanently concluded. Eric sits utterly paralyzed in deep cognitive shock. Observe the inversion of the power dynamic. You and I can pinpoint the moment Eric's cognitive framework collapses. He expects the conditioned victim he programmed, but encounters a completely desensitized subject. His arrogance dissolves, asking if she hates him. Lena's response demonstrates ultimate emotional detachment. She denies hatred. She has achieved total apathy. She clinically dissects his habit of weaponized trauma and demands his signature. Eric attempts a frontal test of dominance, questioning the consequence of refusal. Lena provides a factual prognosis: his immediate demise. Adrian approaches, exuding an apex predator's calm, and escorts her away. The behavioral reality is stark. The true inverse of psychological attachment is never hatred, but absolute indifference. We move outside as stress spikes. Eric breaches the perimeter, shouting the interaction is unresolved. Adrian ceases forward momentum. This is the physiological display of an apex psychopath. It is not uncontrolled rage, but the regulated of absolute destruction. He lowers his voice to a lethal baseline, stating the bond is permanently severed. If Eric fails to process this, Adrian will terminate his life. Eric's narcissistic inflation collapses under the superior threat. Secured in the vehicle, Lena experiences a severe adrenaline crash. Her nervous system misfires, causing violent tremors. Adrian applies steady verbal reinforcement. The clinical reality is evident. Overriding a deep trauma response requires a cognitive expenditure that leaves the individual entirely exhausted. The vehicle becomes an isolation chamber, amplifying her dysregulated breathing. She compresses her torso as the neurological dam finally ruptures. 2 years of repressed terror manifest in an acute emotional release. Adrian kills the engine, initiating a grounding protocol. He pulls her close, allowing her psychological fragmentation to occur against his chest. He repeats auditory affirmations of safety, anchoring her dissociative mind to reality. Demonstrating advanced Stockholm syndrome, she fully integrates his promise of protection, weeping until physically depleted. The psychiatric axiom is non-negotiable. Suppressing extreme trauma guarantees systemic failure. A complete lie psychological collapse is often the mandatory prerequisite for long-term cognitive reconstruction. Lena experiences a conditioned flush of shame for her vulnerability. Adrian provides a pristine handkerchief, injecting a tangible metric of order into her chaos. He clinically validates her emotional purge. The transit back is marked by profound neurological fatigue. Adrian acts as her anchor, yet her traumatized mind continues to loop. She fixates on Eric's visual processing. He perceived a misplaced asset, not a human. You and I must scrutinize this pathology together. Malignant narcissists will incinerate a victim's reality, then demand sympathy for the heat of the flames. Arriving at the estate, baseline security remains unfelt. Psychological rehabilitation does not commence with mere physical safety. It initiates the exact millisecond the victim correctly assigns the blame to the arsonist. Let us open this case file together to examine the pathology of control. The absolute silence of the estate does not soothe Lena, it asphyxiates her. She paces the hardwood, driven by the ghosts of her psychological conditioning. In the shadows, Adrian delivers the news with clinical precision. Eric has weaponized the legal system, filing a report that paints himself as the terrified victim. It is a classic narcissistic inversion of reality. Lena recoils as the fragile architecture of her hope shatters. Adrian outlines their next tactical move, his voice turning to cold granite. You simply cannot negotiate with a malignant obsession. When dealing with someone seeking your complete ruin, you must cease compromise and prepare for the inevitable war. Lena sinks into the heavy leather chair, the suffocating weight of his violent ecosystem pressing against her chest. She whispers her question, asking what those subsequent steps actually entail. Adrian seamlessly sheds the mask of a protector, revealing the cold architect of violence beneath. He speaks of a permanent solution. His clinical logic is brutally simple. When an antagonistic force escalates, the behavioral pattern only ends one way. He asks for a terrible grace, begging her not to despise him for the violence that might follow. She promises not to hate him, yet begs for a bloodless intervention first. Protecting your psychological peace often demands a harsh truth. You must willingly step aside and let toxic individuals fall into the very abyss they constructed. Desperation cracks her voice as she begs for standard legal remedies. Adrian warns her that the institutional framework is already failing. Eric weaponizes the law to tether her indefinitely to his pathology. This psychological attrition will drain her for months, unless they pay the architect of her suffering $50,000 to disappear. Lena recoils at the sickening injustice of rewarding a monster, but Adrian operates purely on the cold mathematics of survival. He softly asks if her ultimate cognitive liberation is worth the ransom. She weeps for the lost principle of the matter. Yet, sometimes being factually right is a terrible substitute for being entirely free. You must recognize when paying the toll is the only viable way to escape the darkness. She fights fiercely, her hands shaking. How does a man who spent 2 years dismantling her psyche walk away with financial prize? Adrian steps closer, reframing the transaction. They are not rewarding Eric, they are rendering him clinically irrelevant. You and I both know the seductive gravity of revenge against an abuser. Yet, Adrian argues that true victory is simply a quiet room. If capital buys her future without spilling blood, it is an absolute triumph. His logic is an icy blade, severing her attachment to the anger. She surrenders, telling him to make the offer. The blinding speed at which Eric accepts the cash proves a bitter psychiatric reality. The people who break us are rarely complex masterminds. They are just hollow shells driven by cheap desires. $50,000. That was the exact market valuation of her cognitive freedom. Eric signed away his violent obsession in seconds. This moment should trigger relief. Yet Lena feels only a dissociative void. 2 years of psychological warfare casually traded for the price of a sedan. The ease of her disposal cuts deeper than any physical contusion. Adrian finds her sitting like a pale statue in the gardens. She is grieving the delusion that suffering held profound meaning. She wanted to believe there was a wounded soul beneath his rage, but he sold her out instantly. Let this be a lasting clinical lesson. The toxic figures we try to save never truly valued our light. Stop pouring your absolute best into a pathological black hole, expecting a dawn that will never arrive. Staring into the dark garden, Lena whispers the cruel question haunting every trauma survivor. What does this cheap ending say about her fundamental worth? Adrian refuses to let the silence linger. His response strikes directly at her cognitive distortion. He asserts the money was never a reflection of her value. It was simply the cost of pathological pest control. When doubt clouds her eyes, Adrian locks his gaze onto hers. He states she is worth every dangerous risk and syndicate complication. Eric was simply too cognitively fractured to comprehend the treasure he held. His steady voice begins to rewrite the damaged neural pathways in her mind. Here is a psychiatric truth to carry with you. Your intrinsic value is never defined by those who are too profoundly broken to perceive it. She offers fragile gratitude, relieved to be perceived as human rather than a narcissistic supply. The syndicate boss softens. Adrian confesses she was never a charity case. Extracting her from that psychological wreckage was O's the only meaningful act in his violent existence. In that breath, the rigid boundary between protector and victim dissolves. She whispers his name, but that raw vulnerability triggers his avoidant attachment. His emotional armor slams brutally back into place. He rises abruptly, retreating behind his cold exterior. With the legal ties severing, she must map out her own destiny. Starting from zero is deeply terrifying. Yet, the total destruction of your old life is never truly an ending. A blank canvas is the most extraordinary therapeutic gift you can receive. He reminds her that she finally possesses autonomy, the core human right stolen by her abuser. Left in the garden, Lena is suspended in a clinical purgatory between a traumatic history and an unwritten future. For 2 years, her existence was defined by hypervigilant survival. She mastered the maladaptive art of shrinking to stay alive. Now, she must relearn how to exist without a constant cortisol spike. The week dissolves. Eric collects his ransom and vanishes. The legal chains shatter. Yet, the anticipated euphoria never arrives, replaced by a profound numbness. I want you to analyze this behavioral paradox with me. When you spend your life running from a burning building, the absolute hardest part of survival is learning how to stand still once the fire is out. Post-liberation, Adrian initiates a masterful pattern of avoidance. The syndicate leader ghosts her, burying himself in underworld politics to avoid their emotional space. Is he reinforcing his defensive barricades or granting her the isolation necessary to recalibrate? The ambiguity leaves Lena psychologically unmoored. Seeking a stabilizing anchor, she returns to a neighborhood cafe to touch a baseline reality. Her friend Maria embraces her, but when pressed about her future, Lena draws a terrifying cognitive blank. She has her physical freedom, but prolonged trauma has rewired her brain. She confesses she has entirely forgotten the psychological mechanics of dreaming. Recovering from devastation is never a fast process. It is a grueling protocol where you must relearn how to be a person from scratch. Maria's voice is a grounding murmur. Reclaim your narrative, she urges. Independent choice is the ultimate assertion of cognitive power. Fueled by this breakthrough, Lena marches back through the estate gates. We observe Adrian, barricaded behind his desk, a physical manifestation of his emotional walls. Yet the second she knocks, he drops everything. Lena steps into the light, inhaling to regulate her nervous system. She is done with the trauma response of flight. She will build her life in the city, but with one non-negotiable boundary. Holding his gay gaze, she announces she is moving out to establish her own sanctuary. True psychological healing demands a terrifying leap into the void. Eventually, you must step out of the fortified, safe zone and face the unpredictable wilderness entirely on your own. The behavioral baseline of the untouchable Don is visibly shaken. A tremor appears in his jaw as Adrian insists she can stay, his voice cracking with uncharacteristic panic. Let us look at this dynamic together. If Lena remains wrapped in his external armor, her internal resilience will atrophy. She explains his overprotective nature is suffocating her post-traumatic growth. He argues she has proven her resilience. But Lena understands external validation is useless if she lacks internal self-trust. She cannot rebuild her ego strength hiding behind guards. The office falls silent. Adrian asks if his wealth makes her feel indebted. It was never about capital. She refuses to play the dependent victim forever. To discover who you truly are, you must strip away the very defense mechanisms that kept you alive in the dark. We observe the physical anatomy of a profound heartbreak. Adrian accepts her boundaries, his features resetting into a mask of stoicism. He turns to the window, granting her spatial autonomy to build her own psychological empire. But then, the mask slips. He locks eyes with her, delivering a promise that alters the room's gravity. Moving out, he swears, does not mean she walks alone. If any hostile force touches her, his protection will materialize. The weight of his extreme loyalty leaves Lena gasping. In her frantic sprint toward cognitive independence, she forgot the addictive warmth of his orbit. She will experience severe withdrawal from this dangerous man. Sometimes, you and I do the exact same thing. We push away the very individuals offering us sanctuary, just to prove we can weather the psychological storm alone. Let us open the file. You and I will clinically unpack the behavioral analysis of these two fractured subjects. Neither patient exhibits the capacity for baseline emotional regulation. Lena displays a textbook trauma response, whispering gratitude to the apex predator acting as her shield. Briefly, Adrian lets his megalomaniac narcissism slip, claiming she is his priority. Then, the psychological fortress rebuilds. He shuffles his paperwork, offering housing contacts in a classic emotional dismissal. Lena internalizes this rejection. 2 weeks later, she sits completely isolated, signing a lease on a fortified apartment. The lesson is stark. Achieving physical freedom is a victory, yet the psychological pursuit of true independence is often the coldest, most isolated trial a survivor can endure. Maria introduces an artificial positive stimulus, hauling boxes, while Lena exhibits acute dissociation. The baseline shifts when Dante enters, yet the psychological absence of the kingpin triggers a severe withdrawal response in our patient. Zero communication from Adrian. Dante avoids eye contact, delivering the clinical directive that his boss requires her to be secure. By nightfall, sensory deprivation takes hold. Lena sits paralyzed, suffocated by the spatial freedom she engineered. She questions her own survival instincts. That first week is a brutal exercise in cognitive adaptation. The dangerous protector is entirely absent from the shadows. She is learning the foundational lesson of trauma recovery. True psychological reconstruction requires you to carry the heaviest burdens entirely on your own. We observe Lena attempting rapid identity synthesis. She masks her psychological trauma by integrating into a high-stimulus environment, projecting artificial stability to unaware civilians. She uses a simple uniform to camouflage internal lacerations. Maria continues monitoring her for behavioral fractures. Lena insists she is establishing autonomous value, detached from narcissistic male control. Yet, her subconscious data reveals a darker pathology. Her nocturnal brain activity repeatedly hallucinates the phantom of her original abuser. Jolt after jolt, her hypervigilant eyes lock onto the heavy iron deadbolts, securing her physical perimeter. The core takeaway remains clinical. Constructing a secure, autonomous environment is the ultimate declaration of cognitive sovereignty. We must catalog the invisible threat matrix Adrian established. If her original abuser resurfaces, the megalomaniac narcissist has authorized his terminal removal. Fear operates as a clinical deterrent. However, as 3 weeks elapse, Adrian's deliberate silence induces acute psychological distress. Dante provides systemic check-ins, citing syndicate politics, but commits a verbal slip. He confirms the kingpin requests daily status reports. Lena attempts to rationalize this isolation as a therapeutic necessity, but the reality mimics Stockholm Syndrome. She exhibits severe withdrawal from his authoritative control and the impenetrable psychological barrier he provided. Behavioral patterns show we frequently sabotage essential bonds simply because our neurological pathways remain too damaged to process reality. The subject's isolation is breached when Rosa infiltrates the environment. Rosa introduces a nutritional stimulus and a perceptive cognitive evaluation, immediately identifying Lena's defense mechanisms. Lena attempts to manifest a victim complex, but Rosa possesses 8 years of conditioned survival within a sociopathic crime syndicate. She recognizes emotional hemorrhage instantly. With clinical precision, Rosa dismantles Lena's facade of autonomous detachment. When the patient deflects, Rosa introduces a critical therapeutic intervention. You do not require an unblemished behavioral record to achieve stability. You cannot suspend your existence while waiting for trauma to perfectly resolve. Lena adopts a closed posture, crossing her arms to block the analysis. True psychological rehabilitation is never a passive endeavor. The psychological barriers undergo structural failure, resulting in acute emotional discharge. Lena verbalizes a profound identity crisis, uncertain of her parameters without the gravity of chronic suffering. How does a subject synthesize reality when the brain remains trapped in hyperarousal? Rosa prescribes a ruthless cognitive adjustment, dictating that autonomy does not mandate total isolation. The kingpin extracted her from trauma, yet remained engaged due to her intrinsic value, not her pathology. Forming a reciprocal attachment is a valid variable. Utilizing historical trauma as a permanent psychological barricade is a self-inflicted pathology. Projecting an impenetrable exterior often blinds patients to the stabilizing support standing directly within their immediate radius. Consider the cortisol spike as the subject attempts to initiate contact. Lena exhibits motor tremors, lifting the device 3 times before executing the call. The apex predator answers instantly. Bypassing her avoidance protocols, she invites him into her controlled environment. The silence extends to the brink of a panic response before his low vocal frequency confirms the parameters. She spends hours sterilizing her habitat, a frantic coping mechanism to neutralize their chaotic dynamic. On schedule, the criminal architect arrives at her threshold, presenting anomalous behavioral markers of vulnerability. She quietly grants him entry, initiating verbal exposure of a fragile internal emotional state remains the most severe stress test a human psyche can possibly endure. The subjects engage in low-stakes dialogue, creating an artificial simulation of human interaction. Upon depletion of the chemical depressant, Lena abruptly dismantles the illusion. Maintaining ocular contact, she verbalizes her systemic failure. Adrian uses silence as an interrogation tactic. She confesses to battling cognitive distortions, so focused on asserting autonomy that she abandoned baseline functionality. Removing her psychological armor, she admits to symptoms resembling Stockholm Syndrome, openly craving his specific validation. Adrian physically reacts, disrupting her speech pattern to aggressively diagnose her with emotional confusion. Achieving genuine vulnerability requires the total dismantling of primary defense mechanisms, which remains a terrifying clinical exposure. Environmental stressors escalate, yet the subject refuses to engage a flight response. Lena maintains an assertive posture, verbalizing a conscious decision to merge their pathways. She classifies this not as trauma bonding, but as a calculated recognition of positive behavioral changes induced by his proximity. Adrian attempts to trigger her self-preservation instincts. He lists his own sociopathic traits, emphasizing the high probability of violent collateral damage. Lena's physiological baseline remains steady. She breaches his physical boundary, grasping his hand to establish dominant agency over the choice. The megalomaniac narcissist experiences an immediate psychological collapse under her touch. True courage is the deliberate cessation of avoidance behaviors to embrace a concrete reality. Observe the microexpressions, altering Adrian's stance. The criminal profile categorized itself as a mere extraction vehicle from her trauma zone. He never hypothesized she would classify him as a primary attachment figure. Lena identifies him as the sole entity who intervened during her crisis, providing a shield without asserting ownership. When she labels herself a defective object, Adrian's jaw contracts. He overrides her cognitive distortion, reframing her condition not as structural failure, but as a temporary deformation under psychological gravity. He pulls her in, initiating deep physical contact in the shadows. Two damaged organisms synthesizing mutual heat. A crucial lesson: you only need one steady external source to validate that your core matrix remains completely intact. You and I must realize that cognitive rehabilitation is never a linear dataset. It is an erratic progression. Lena maintains independence, yet conditions herself to use Adrian as a somatic regulator during panic episodes. Relying on a secondary nervous system does not negate personal sovereignty. Simultaneously, the sociopathic leader deconstructs his psychological vault, exposing his own suppressed traumas. Their integration is volatile, creating friction between her pathological pride and his reflex to neutralize threats with lethal force. Yet, their psychological defects interlock with clinical precision. A functional existence does not eliminate environmental hazards. It simply requires a reliable organism willing to systematically process the hazardous debris beside you. We observe Lena moving through her stabilized environment, a textbook case in post-traumatic growth. She redirects her focus to become a resource for subjects trapped in identical abusive cycles. The Kingpin acts as a covert benefactor, funding her education to prove autonomy can coexist with strategic support. 12 months post-extraction, she enters Adrian's compound, not as a captive, but through calculated, autonomous selection. The psychological imprint of her former abuser now registers as a statistical zero. She projects only clinical indifference toward his existence. The ultimate behavioral milestone is clear. Absolute cognitive power does not manifest as violent retribution. It is analyzing the architect of your trauma and registering a complete, unshakable absence of emotional data. The acute terror of her past fractures, revealing a complex new pathology. We observe the aftermath of severe trauma. This psychological bond peaks on an ordinary Tuesday. Across the table, Adrian, a textbook megalomaniacal narcissist, fixes his dark eyes on hers and demands marriage. Lena studies the dangerous lines of a kingpin who worships her and whispers yes. Notice the survivor's hypervigilance. She instantly erects boundaries, demanding ironclad contracts and separate accounts. Adrian does not rage. His chest vibrates with a deep, chilling laugh, yielding without hesitation. The clinical takeaway is vital. You do not need a flawless psyche to secure profound devotion, but you must always demand to enter the dynamic as an absolute, uncompromising equal. You and I have analyzed trauma bonds shifting into balanced partnerships. Adrian whispers a cognitive distortion, claiming she rescued herself while he held the keys. Lena touches his face, dismantling his theory. They pulled each other from the abyss. He provided a fortress. She gave an antisocial kingpin an anchor to human empathy. Their wedding stands as a defiant monument against the pathology they survived. Dante raises a glass, observing how Lena neutralized his boss's violent sociopathy. At the altar, Lena's nervous system settles. Her breathing shifts from the ragged gasps of a victim into the steady pulse of a victor. The lesson is absolute. No matter how suffocating the psychological nightmare, you possess the autonomous power to rewrite your final prognosis. We are witnessing the pinnacle of her psychological evolution. Lena achieves cognitive integration, realizing her traumatic past was the stressor required to forge her resilience. In their quiet bedroom, Adrian holds her, probing for depressive rumination. He asks where her mind wanders. She turns, her effect bright and regulated, marveling at her metamorphosis. When asked about lingering resentment, her response is a masterclass in radical acceptance. She holds zero regrets. Every agonizing episode of abuse was a necessary variable leading to his door. She would not trade a single burn from that fire. Adrian kisses her forehead in uncharacteristic reverence. Note this essential truth. Hitting emotional rock bottom is often the unique catalyst teaching a human mind the vast difference between merely surviving and truly existing. Observing Lena's micro-expressions reveals unyielding resolve. She declares a total refusal to remain a passive bystander while others endure acute trauma. Adrian brushes her cheek, noting she already exhibits strong altruistic tendencies. Her mind drifts to victims currently dissociating on cold tiles, trapped in cycles of learned helplessness. She knows the statistical impossibility of saving everyone, but resolves to be the protective barrier Adrian modeled. 3 years post-trauma, Lena establishes a sanctuary, a secure behavioral milieu for shattered psyches. This brings us to a profound psychological realization. The ultimate responsibility of surviving severe trauma is determining your next action. Your most devastating scars can mutate into the exact diagnostic map needed to guide another human being out of the inferno. The sanctuary is engineered to lower cortisol levels, allowing hypervigilant minds to finally regulate. Adrian silently leverages his antisocial network, funneling illicit capital into a web of safe houses. A terrified new admission steps inside, exhibiting classic physical markers of acute battery. She believes her life is over. Lena bypasses hollow psychiatric platitudes. She uses a somatic grounding technique, pressing a warm cup into the girl's trembling hands to force sensory presence. She delivers the clinical reality. The withdrawal from the trauma bond will be excruciating, but she will never navigate that fire alone. Lena recalls blindly entering a kingpin's vehicle. The documented lesson is clear. Sometimes executing a terrifying behavioral leap is the absolute only statistical method to locate solid ground again. Let's examine the clinical brilliance of this outcome. You and I, Lena, escaped a psychological abyss. Instead of developing vindictive traits, used Bridget, she engineered a mechanism for collective healing. The fascinating twist: she exhibits zero compulsion for revenge. Her abuser remains paralyzed in a narcissistic victim complex. Lena refused to expend cognitive resources, destroying him. She reconstructed her fragmented psyche into a functional shield for the vulnerable. Resting against Adrian's chest, she realizes she permanently disarmed the pathology that once dictated her reality. She validates Adrian for providing positive regard when she felt erased. The ultimate psychiatric truth is this: the most profound victory against malignant abuse is ensuring the trauma cycle terminates with your recovery. We close this case file by observing a city humming with undocumented psychological trauma. Somewhere in the dark, another subject stares into a mirror. She traces the contusions of abuse, performing a horrifying neurological calculus, weighing the statistical danger of remaining against the terrifying unknown of escape. But at dawn, she might generate the desperate executive function needed to enter Lena's clinic. Lena will be standing in the regulated light, ready to extend the exact clinical intervention a kingpin once offered her. This is the final lesson of our analysis. Surviving the acute phase of severe trauma is merely the baseline prologue. The true, statistically significant victory is the functional empire you construct from the ashes of your own pathology. Lena has permanently deactivated her flight response. She is finally, truly alive.